First, the mission, the observer mission, will not succeed. It cannot succeed. The Syrian government is not willing to implement the full Arab action plan, which involved not just monitors, it also involved releasing all detainees, pulling back all heavy troops, heavy weapons, etc., heavy units out of the cities and towns and villages, etc., ending the use of gunfire, violence, etc., against demonstrators. There were a whole number of measures, some of which have been done partially. We have no means of verifying how much they've done, for instance, in terms of releasing detainees. It's clear that they've not really pulled out their armed men out of city centers, not even the tanks in many cases, let alone snipers or under, plainclothes people. So my feeling is that this mission cannot succeed because the Syrian regime, in a way, can't afford to deliver on these things. That doesn't mean that the mission will necessarily be declared officially over or dead anytime soon, because I think there's going to be a sort of cat and mouse game for a while. The Syrian government just days ago declared that it was willing to renew the mandate of the mission, but not to expand the scope of the mission in Syria. So I think there's going to be this constant tightening, this hardline rhetoric coming from Syria at times. We saw President Bashar al-Assad's speech a week ago, which was something of a tough speech, basically saying that this opposition had to be wiped out by force. But then, on the other hand, you get them sending out envoys to talk to the opposition abroad, or saying, no, we do want to renew the mandate of the observer mission. So there's this constant blowing hot and cold, through which they buy time, they extend the process, they wear down the Arab League. I, for instance, am not confident that the League of Arab States will be able to maintain its pace of resolutions. There was a period from November through December where the League of Arab States responded very quickly and decisively and actively to developments in Syria. But I don't see what more they can do. And at the moment, I think the League of Arab States has run out of ideas of what to do further down the line. Go to the UN? Well, that's been an option all along, and they didn't go there for a reason. One reason being, of course, that Russia and China are blocking anything that's too severe against Syria at the United Nations Security Council, and they will veto any resolutions, certainly of military intervention, but possibly even of more severe sanctions. And if the Arab League can't do it, the UN can't do it. So I think we're in a situation where none of these missions or initiatives will actually succeed, but the attempts are going to go on and on and on for, I think, the rest of this year at least. Civil war, in the proper sense of the term, involves the massive use of organized force by two sides, which go into total mobilization for the purpose of confronting the other side. Obviously, the Syrian government or the regime has that sort of capability. It hasn't needed to use its capability so far. I mean, something like 75% of the army, it's believed, is still in its barracks. This has to do with the fact that the regime doesn't want to place large numbers of conscripts and ground forces face to face with their own people in towns and cities they may come from themselves, and tell them to shoot people who may be their own family. This is a sure recipe for the falling apart of the army. We saw this in Iran in 1978-79, for instance. So the regime definitely doesn't want to risk that. But my point is that so far it's been able to operate against the opposition for about 9 months without even calling up the army. So it's way away from having expended its assets. On the other side, the opposition, the main parts of the Syrian opposition, have insisted on this being a peaceful civilian uprising in order to try and deactivate the use of violence in which the government will always win. And so why fight it on that ground? Also, the opposition has sought the moral higher ground, of course, in showing that this is a regime that is not for the people because it shoots at its own people. However, there are defectors from the Syrian army. There are instances of people fighting back and shooting back at the government forces. Now, I think that so long as there are no safe havens protected by external military power from Arab states, from Turkey, from the US, from NATO, from whoever, as long as there are no no-fly zones, no border sanctuaries, whatever you want to call them, to which large units from the army could defect and find shelter while they regroup and reassemble and get ready to launch attacks. As long as that doesn't exist, then I don't think there's a military option for the opposition. And the stream of defections from the Syrian army is probably already being slowed down and inhibited by the knowledge of large numbers of troops and their officers who might otherwise defect, that they have nowhere to defect to, nowhere to hide, to assemble, to collect. At most, what they can do is run into some of the hills in the south or the north, maybe the border region near Turkey, in some towns that are out of control, or some neighborhoods of the main cities that have escaped government control. So you can hide a few dozen men, a few hundred men, maybe 1,000 here, 2,000 there. But that's not a civil war. And I don't see that happening so long as the government has basically full control of the ground and of the air and of its borders. And there is no assurance of an external military cover or protective cover for anyone who defects to the other side. The Syrian opposition is very diverse, and one could say very disunited. I mean, in the sense that there are a great many different groups. It took a long time really to assemble them, pull them together into even 2 or 3 main fronts. And even then, managing relations within these coalitions has not been easy. It's evident that personal relations, factional relations are not always comfortable or stable. That said, I think the Syrian opposition have achieved reasonable success, given the odds, given the fact that they've never been able to operate openly inside Syria. They're scattered outside Syria. There are big issues of whether the Syrian opposition based in the outside is legitimate. And this is always a problem. Well, how can you survive under an authoritarian regime that won't hesitate to throw you in prison or torture you on the one hand? But if you go outside the country, then you lose direct contact with people. You're not suffering the same things they suffer. And therefore, how legitimate are your choices and policy preferences? So there are all these things that are sort of challenges to the opposition. What I think has helped the Syrian opposition is that inside Syria, an opposition movement has emerged, the coordination committees, and these have lent a lot of credibility and legitimacy to the opposition outside Syria. And the fact that they finally, not easily and not immediately, but finally managed to establish a basic common platform between the inside and the outside has helped give them a certain amount of extra credibility and legitimacy also in front of foreign governments. So when the Syrian opposition, for instance, convened in Tunisia a couple of months back or so, a month and a half ago, this was precisely because they'd managed to reach a certain level of unity and of speaking with one voice that gave them credibility. However, my real concern is that in the coming year, if, as I think, the situation will drag on in a sort of hurting stalemate, the opposition will face this dilemma of, all right, what do we do next? So my feeling is that the Syrian opposition is going to face extremely difficult discussions in the coming months and find it increasingly challenging to maintain unity and cohesion and agreement on a single common platform. I don't think there is going to be any external military intervention in Syria at all, not from anyone. Not from the Arab states, for sure. There is no Arab state that has the military capability of intervening in Syria. Syria has a large army, something like 250,000 men. It has a lot of battle experience. It has effective systems, weapon systems, at least comparable to what might be used against it locally. And the Syrian army over the past decade, at least since Bashar al-Assad assumed the presidency, has been undergoing certain forms of transformation in terms of developing special forces and encouraging certain types of new tactics and doctrines, etc. What I'm trying to say basically is that who's going to take this on? Western powers already feel that even for the very highly advanced American and European air forces, for instance, to do over Syria what they did over Libya, i.e. to implement a no-fly zone, which involves taking out the entire air defense system and or air force in the local country. They understand that even though their systems are way ahead of the Syrian ones, the Syrians are far more capable than the Libyans were, for all sorts of reasons. I think the West is stuck really in a position where it's not at all obvious what options it has. First of all, because it doesn't really have a military option of intervening. Partly because Russia and China would veto a UN-based intervention, and I think they would stand very firmly against a non-UN intervention, let's say under NATO terms. I don't think Turkey would go along with providing the sort of logistical support and deployment support that would be necessary to approach Syria with an intervention. The Russian Navy has been visiting very visibly Syrian ports in the last few months. None of this is an option. So what are we left with? Sanctions, economic sanctions. Well, whether it's Cuba since 1960 or something, whether it's Iraq from 1990 onwards, Libya, in most cases where economic sanctions have been imposed, they have been extremely slow, inefficient, and they've usually done tremendous damage to the local population without necessarily removing the regime. We talk about smart sanctions and targeted sanctions that aim mainly at the regime itself, which is good. It's at least good that the attempt is being made. But I think the reality is that the moment those are put into practice, and this is what the League of Arab States, by the way, decreed at the end of November, smart sanctions against the regime, while allowing the movement of capital and trade in goods that are important for the survival of ordinary people. They tried to make that distinction. Reality is that if that's the sort of flow that continues, then probably the regime will be even more comfortable. You prevent regime officials from traveling, you close some of their bank accounts, but that doesn't mean the end of the world for them. So the dilemma is for the West that the only real options are either military or economic sanctions. And economic sanctions are extremely blunt instruments, which are rarely successful, and even then only after 10 or 20 years. Well, the regional significance of the Syrian uprising is certainly very important in terms of the geopolitics of those who wish to confront Iran, then certainly by changing the most important Arab ally of Iran, that necessarily weakens the Iranian geopolitical position. There are those, including the Iranians, who feel that if Syria is lost to Iran, that this is both a net gain to the so-called Sunni Arabs, on the one hand, Saudi Arabia or Jordan, Egypt, etc., but also that this offers a new opportunity for the expansion of Turkish influence and leadership, because the neighbor, Turkey, has very long historical social and economic trade ties with Syria. Even under today's, at least until a year ago, it had very extensive relations with Syria. And I think post-conflict in Syria, Turkey will play an immense role. And from the Iranian perspective, this is highly undesirable, and they resent this. And in fact, for several months already, there's been this continuous sort of campaign among Iranian propaganda outlets, academic, pseudo-academic websites, etc., criticizing Turkey, calling Turkey, duplicitous, saying that really they're doing America's bidding or Israel's bidding. So there are these very clear geopolitical dimensions to this. One further consequence there, I think, and we already, I think, can see this, is that to the extent that Iran risks losing Syria as an ally, it's going to focus all the more of its efforts on securing its influence in Iraq. And I think that the current crisis in the Iraqi government, between increasingly the sort of the Shia-dominated prime minister's position versus the Vice President Hashemi, who's a Sunni, and a whole range of questions that are arising over control of the armed forces, over the oil law, etc. These are all getting revived partly because of this sort of tectonic shift. Beyond that, I think the one further thing is that just as people said while the Libyan conflict was ongoing, that if Muammar Gaddafi survives, this is going to be immensely important for other autocrats and other authoritarian regimes, starting with that of Syria. I think now we might say the same again, that the survival of the Assad government or Assad regime in Syria will have a knock-on effect for others in the region, including, say, Yemen's Ali Abdullah Saleh, who so far still clings on to power. And let me point out that I don't think it's easily a matter of, the good guys against the bad guys or the Democrats against the non-Democrats. I don't think that in the Gulf region itself, in Saudi Arabia, for instance, and maybe all and at least most of the Gulf monarchies, their goal in Syria is not regime change. It's not transfer of power. I think we make a mistake when we assume that just because the Gulf took the initiative finally in Syria and started to insist on ending the Syrian crisis, that means they want Bashar al-Assad out. This is not a second Yemen scenario where they actually came in and tried to help ease out Saleh and find exits for him. On the contrary, it's one where they want Bashar al-Assad to accept a new power-sharing formula which will allow him to stay in power, but under a new framework, and that distances Syria from Iran. But that's about as far as they really want things to go.